The Appalachian air carried a silence too heavy to be natural, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The mist clung to the trees, wrapping the forest in a suffocating veil, as if it wished to hide what lay beneath. Locals never ventured past the old stone bridge after sundown. They said the land beyond didn't belong to men anymore, that it was claimed by a family long forgotten, a family that had sinned against nature itself. The discovery of the cabin came on a day that began with nothing more sinister than the sound of crunching leaves underfoot and the chatter of wind through the treetops. The hikers hadn't planned to venture that far into the Appalachian woods, but curiosity has a way of bending even the firmest plans. It was early autumn, the forest tinted with rust and gold, and the air had that sharpness that made each breath feel colder than the last. The path had long since dissolved into roots and moss, leaving them guided only by instinct and the faint, eerie sense that something was watching. When the first of them spotted the cabin, half sunken into the slope of a hill, it didn't look like much, just a structure swallowed by time. But as they drew closer, it became clear that this place was no ordinary relic of mountain life. The cabin's wood was blackened not by fire but by decay, soaked through from decades of rain and silence. Ivy crawled up its sides like veins, gripping at the roof as though nature itself was trying to drag it back underground. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as if something had brushed against it from the inside. It stood in a small clearing that shouldn't have existed, the trees around it bent away, their trunks twisted unnaturally, forming a circle that almost felt deliberate. One of the hikers joked about it being a witch's house, but the laughter that followed was weak and short-lived. Something about the air felt wrong, heavier, as though the place was holding its breath. The first thing they noticed upon stepping closer were the carvings. The outer walls were etched with strange markings, spirals and symbols that resembled family crests but lacked any logic or symmetry. Near the doorframe, scrawled in something dark and long-dried, were words half erased by weather, "Leave what's ours." The letters appeared smeared, as if written in haste or fear. The windows were covered from the inside, blocked by layers of boards nailed crosswise, though small slivers of light still managed to pierce through. Dust motes drifted lazily in those beams, catching the glint of something metallic beneath the porch, perhaps a rusted locket, or maybe just a trick of the light. As the hikers hesitated, a low sound carried from within the cabin, a faint rustling, followed by what might have been a whisper, or the sigh of the old wood. One of them swore they heard a child humming, though no one else would confirm it. The group exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier curiosity curdling into dread. What they didn't yet know was that this cabin had been found before, by others who'd never spoken of it again, and that every visitor left with something unseen clinging to their soul. The moment the hikers stepped into the clearing, the woods fell silent, as though the forest itself was waiting. They had barely begun to circle the cabin when the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for imagination. At first, it was nothing more than a breath through the trees, a soft exhale winding between branches, but then it became something else. The whisper came again, low and wavering, like the voice of someone trying to speak from underground. One of the hikers froze, tilting his head toward the cabin. Beneath the creak of wood and the groan of old nails, there was a sound unmistakable in its human quality, crying. Faint, distant, and heart-wrenching. It seemed to come from beneath the cabin floor, muffled as though trapped under layers of earth. The group stood motionless, listening. The crying wasn't constant, it came in gasps and pauses, as if whoever it was down there was struggling to breathe. A woman's voice whispered something unintelligible in the wind, and just like that, the forest seemed to lean in closer. The air grew colder, the stillness thicker. One of them, the youngest of the group, called out, his voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the echo of his own words dissolving into the trees. The wind stirred again, brushing through the clearing with a mournful hum, and that's when they heard it clearly, a child's sob, soft and broken, followed by 3 slow knocks from somewhere deep within the cabin walls. Panic flickered through the group, but curiosity held stronger than fear. They crept toward the cabin's entrance, pushing the door open with a drawn-out groan that echoed far too long for the size of the room. Inside, the air was dense and cold, the smell of mildew and rot pressing against their lungs. Dust floated like ash in the light that filtered through the cracks, and the floorboards sagged beneath their steps. Then came the sound again, closer this time. It was no longer beneath them but all around, as though the walls themselves were crying. One of the hikers knelt and placed an ear to the floor, only to jolt back when a sudden vibration pulsed through the wood, followed by what felt like the faintest tap from below. The others stood in silence, staring at the spot where the sound had come from. The crying ceased, replaced by a whisper that none of them could fully understand, yet every one of them heard. It wasn't just noise, it was a plea, a warning, a promise. The wind rose again, swirling through the gaps in the boards, carrying the same faint cry into the forest beyond, until it vanished into the trees like it had never been there at all. Inside the cabin, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay, a smell that clung to their clothes and seemed to seep into their skin. Every step stirred up clouds of dust that glimmered faintly in the dim light, giving the illusion of movement where there was none. The group spread out cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the murk and revealing what time had done to the place: collapsed furniture, a rocking chair with one arm missing, and a fireplace filled with blackened ash that hadn't seen flame in decades. It was in that suffocating stillness that one of them noticed something hanging crookedly on the far wall, half hidden behind a torn curtain. When the fabric was pulled aside, the beam of the flashlight fell upon an old photograph framed in cracked glass, its image nearly faded to sepia ghosts. The picture showed a young girl, perhaps no older than 12, standing beside a man whose hand rested stiffly on her shoulder. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, the same wide, pale eyes, the same slant to the jaw, even the same faint scar cutting across the left brow. It was as though the girl had been molded in his image, a smaller, frilier reflection of the man himself. Both stared directly into the camera, their expressions vacant and unsettlingly calm. There was no warmth between them, no hint of family affection, only a strange stillness, as if they were holding their breath when the photo was taken. The hikers leaned closer, and that was when one of them noticed what lay in the background, a faint outline of the very same cabin they now stood in, though in the photo it appeared newer, freshly built, the woods behind it younger, alive. Something about the image made their skin crawl. The man's eyes, despite the fading of the photo, seemed almost too sharp, too alive, as if they were watching even now. One of the hikers joked weakly that the man could have been the girl's father, but no one laughed. Another pointed out a strange detail, the faint smudge of a shadow behind the pair, human-shaped but without definition, like someone else had been standing just out of frame. When the flashlight passed over the glass, the reflection split their faces into fragments, scattering the image into something monstrous and unrecognizable. The girl's eyes caught the light, and for a moment, they appeared to glisten with moisture, as though she were on the verge of tears. A sudden gust rattled the walls, and the photograph shifted slightly in its frame, the glass cracking further down the middle, slicing cleanly between the girl and the man, as though something unseen had finally decided to separate them. When the hikers finally left the cabin, the world outside felt strangely different, as if the forest itself had grown denser, the air heavier with something unseen. They made their way down the mountain, shaken by what they'd found inside but unwilling to admit how deeply it had unsettled them. The path led them to a small, forgotten town nestled in the folds of the valley, a place that didn't appear on modern maps. Its streets were quiet, the buildings leaning with age, and the few people they saw moved slowly, as though burdened by something far older than time. The hikers stopped at a rundown diner near the edge of town, hoping for warmth, coffee, and perhaps answers. The moment they mentioned the cabin, though, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations at nearby tables stopped. The waitress, her face pale beneath the flicker of neon light, simply shook her head and told them not to speak of such things here. The oldest man in the diner, sitting alone by the window, watched them for a long while before finally speaking. His voice was thin and trembling, each word carrying the weight of memory he'd rather forget. He told them that some places in those mountains were never meant to be found again. The cabin, he said, was a scar left on the land, a reminder of a family that had turned its back on God and humanity both. Generations ago, a man had built that home for himself and his daughter, swearing that their bloodline would remain untouched by outsiders. The townsfolk had tried to help, at first, offering food and supplies, but the men refused, becoming more reclusive with each passing year. When the daughter stopped appearing in town altogether, the whispers began, rumors of strange cries echoing through the woods, of lights seen dancing at night, of children who never lived long enough to be named. No one in town dared go near the place after that. Those who did came back changed, speaking in broken sentences, unable to sleep through the night. Some vanished entirely, leaving behind only footprints leading toward the forest. The old man's voice dropped to a whisper when he told the hikers that the family's name had been erased from local records long ago, their graves left unmarked to keep their curse from spreading. Some bloodlines, he said, his eyes fixed on the window, should have ended when the earth first covered them. The hikers sat in silence, the clink of coffee cups and the hum of the old ceiling fan suddenly unbearable. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint echo from the mountains, a cry that sounded far too human to be just the wind. Later that evening, unable to let go of what they had seen and heard, the hikers decided to return to the cabin before leaving the valley. The sky had turned a deep bruised gray, and the forest felt heavier, quieter than before, as if the trees themselves were waiting for something. They moved with caution this time, flashlights cutting thin beams through the fog that hung low to the ground. When they reached the cabin again, it looked different, darker, more sunken into the earth, its windows like empty sockets watching them approach. One of them noticed the door, which they were sure had been left half open, was now firmly shut. Still, they pressed on, drawn by a pull they couldn't explain. Inside, the air was colder, thick with the smell of wet soil and rot. That was when one of them saw it, an old leather-bound book lying half-buried under a collapsed shelf near the corner of the room. It was a journal, its cover cracked and brittle with age, tied shut by a piece of faded ribbon. The pages were warped, yellowed, and smudged with something dark that looked disturbingly like blood. As they carefully opened it, the first few entries seemed ordinary enough, dated over a century ago, written in a looping, careful hand that spoke of a woman's touch. She described daily life in the mountains, the cold winters, and the isolation of their cabin far from any neighbors. But as they turned the pages, the tone began to shift. The writer spoke of her father in reverent, fearful language, how he forbade her from speaking to strangers, how he said the outside world was wicked and that their blood was special, chosen. The words grew more frantic, more desperate, with each entry. She wrote of how she longed to leave, yet every attempt ended with her being locked away beneath the floorboards for days, the darkness pressing against her skin until she could barely breathe. Further in, the entries turned darker still. She began referring to herself as both daughter and wife, her words splintered by confusion and guilt. She described the birth of her first child, the strange ritual her father performed under the blood-red moon, the way he whispered that purity had to be protected. Her handwriting grew erratic, trembling, as she confessed to hearing crying at night from beneath the cabin, cries that sounded like her own voice, but younger. The final entry ended abruptly, the ink smeared by what could have been tears. The last readable line read, "He says our family will never die. But I hear them under the floor, and they want to be free." The hikers closed the book in silence, realizing the crying they'd heard before hadn't been imagined, it had been remembered. The journal grew more disturbing with every word, and by the time the hikers reached the section dated around the full moon, their hands were trembling too much to turn the pages steadily. The writing had changed, no longer neat, but jagged and hurried, as though written in fear or pain. The girl spoke of nights when the sky turned red and the air grew still, of her father gathering her and the children in the single room, muttering prayers that didn't belong to any religion she knew. He spoke of the purity of the blood, and how the world beyond their cabin would poison what they had created if they ever let it in. Those nights were called the blood moon births, and she wrote of them as if they were both sacred and cursed. The rituals always began the same way, with the extinguishing of every flame in the cabin and the sound of chanting that seemed to come from the woods outside, even though she and her father were the only ones there. She described how the moonlight bled through the cracks in the roof, painting everything in shades of crimson, and how her father would place symbols on the walls using animal blood. He said they kept the family safe, that the spirits of their ancestors watched through the trees. But the girl wrote that she could see figures moving outside, shapes that didn't belong to any animal she knew. They whispered to her, called her name, and sometimes she thought they looked like the faces of her children who hadn't survived the winter. Her father called them blessings taken back by the forest, but she no longer believed him. The rituals grew more violent over time. He would bury things beneath the cabin after each one, small bundles wrapped in cloth, still and silent. The girl wrote that she was forbidden to ask what they were, but she already knew. In one entry, she confessed that her father believed the blood moon was a gift that renewed their line, that each child born under it carried a piece of immortality. But she began to fear that something else was happening, that with each ritual, the forest was taking more of them than it gave. The animals had vanished, and the silence in the woods became so deep she could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the walls. Her last description of a blood moon night was barely legible, words trailing off mid-sentence as if she had been interrupted. The final words before the ink bled out read, "He says we are eternal now, but I can feel them beneath us, moving, waiting for the next moon." The hikers stared at the page in horror, realizing the crimson stains weren't only ink, they were proof that she had written those words with her own blood. After reading the final legible entry in the journal, the hikers could no longer ignore the unease that had been growing since they first entered the cabin. The night outside had thickened into a fog that clung to the windows like breath on glass, and every sound from the forest seemed amplified: the groan of the trees, the rustle of unseen movement, the wind carrying faint voices that might have been mistaken for whispers. One of them, standing near the window, froze when he thought he saw a figure move between the trees, tall and slow, just beyond the reach of their flashlight. When he blinked, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. Another hiker swore he heard his name whispered from somewhere deep in the woods, the voice fragile and familiar, like a memory from childhood. They tried to convince themselves it was just the wind, but the wind doesn't call you by name. The forest outside began to move in strange rhythms, as if alive with things unseen. Branches swayed though there was no breeze, and the faint glow of the moon seemed to pulse behind the clouds like a heartbeat. Then, from the darkness came the first whisper of the girl's name, the one written in the journal. It came from everywhere at once, weaving through the trees, through the cracks in the cabin walls, soft and broken, as though someone were speaking through water. The hikers froze, too terrified to speak. The name came again, this time clearer, carrying a tone of sorrow and longing rather than malice. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, brief and echoing, fading as suddenly as it came. One of the hikers, trembling, opened the cabin door a few inches to look outside. The fog was so thick he could barely see past the porch, but there were shapes moving in it, pale, shifting figures that glided between the trees, their outlines flickering like candlelight. As he strained to see, one of them turned toward him, and though it had no clear face, he could feel its eyes meeting his. The air turned icy, every breath crystallizing in his throat. Behind him, the journal on the floor flipped open on its own, pages rustling violently as if caught in a storm that didn't exist. The wind that followed carried a faint, familiar sound, the voice of the girl, whispering not words, but a single drawn-out hum, the same lullaby they had all heard when they first arrived. It echoed through the clearing, soft and mournful, and with it came the overwhelming certainty that she was still there, trapped between the roots and the earth, calling out to anyone foolish enough to listen. By the time dawn began to pale the sky, none of the hikers had slept. The journal lay open on the floor where it had fallen, its pages fluttering like something still alive. The whispers had faded with the night, but the air inside the cabin remained heavy and cold, as though whatever had stirred in the dark was still watching from somewhere close. When the first beam of sunlight cut through the fog, one of them noticed something strange outside, a patch of ground near the edge of the clearing where the earth looked disturbed, darker than the rest, as if it had been freshly turned. The group stepped cautiously into the morning mist, drawn by an unspoken dread that each of them felt in their bones. As they approached, they saw that the soil wasn't just loose, it was marked. Small wooden planks, rotting and barely upright, jutted from the ground in uneven rows. Some bore faint initials carved by a trembling hand, while others were completely blank. The realization came slowly and terribly: they were standing in a graveyard. Not a proper one, but something hidden, secret, as if whoever buried the bodies wanted them forgotten. There were at least a dozen graves, some so small they couldn't belong to adults. The ground beneath their feet felt soft, sinking slightly as if hollow beneath the surface. One of the hikers knelt and brushed away the layer of dead leaves covering one of the markers. The letters were faint but legible, matching initials they had seen in the journal entries, the same names the girl had written about, her lost children, her father's blessings. Another hiker found a bone protruding through the soil, pale and smooth as ivory. It looked too delicate to belong to an animal. As they stood frozen, the forest seemed to exhale. The trees swayed though the air was still, and a low hum rose from the ground, a vibration so subtle it could have been mistaken for the tremor of fear in their own bodies. Then, faintly, came the sound of crying again, muffled and distant, as though coming from beneath the graves themselves. One of the hikers stumbled back, whispering that they needed to leave, but another couldn't move, transfixed by the smallest grave near the back of the clearing. It had no marker, no initials, only a crude toy carved from wood resting on top, a doll with one eye missing. The hiker reached down to touch it, and the moment his fingers brushed the surface, the air turned bitterly cold. The ground beneath the grave shifted, the soil quivering as if something below had stirred awake, and from the depths came a soft voice, barely audible but unmistakably human, whispering the girl's name over and over until it dissolved into the rustle of the trees. When they finally gathered the courage to return to the cabin, the hikers carried the journal with them, determined to finish reading it in hopes of finding some kind of explanation. The morning light had already begun to fade beneath thick, low clouds that swallowed the mountains, turning the day into a gray, oppressive dusk. Inside, The air was colder than before, the floorboards damp and slick beneath their boots. The final pages of the journal were nearly unreadable, the ink smeared and the handwriting so uneven it looked like it had been written in darkness. The girl's words trembled across the paper, her sentences breaking off, thoughts colliding as if her mind had begun to unravel. She wrote about her father's voice echoing from beneath the floor even after he had stopped breathing, how she heard him calling to her from the soil, promising that the bloodline would never end. She confessed to burying him herself one night when the moon was full and red, but afterward, she could still hear him moving below, whispering that he would return when the earth was ready. As the hikers read, a strange stillness filled the cabin. The wind outside had stopped completely, the forest falling into that unnatural silence that feels like the moment before a storm breaks. The girl's last entry described how she had finally decided to end it all. She wrote of her plan to burn the cabin, to destroy everything her father had created before the next blood moon rose, but the entry faltered halfway through, the words trailing off mid-sentence as though she had been interrupted. The final line was jagged and incomplete, "He's in the walls now. I can hear him," and then nothing but a long dark smear across the page. One of the hikers whispered that maybe she never escaped, that perhaps she was still somewhere beneath them. The moment he said it, the house gave a low groan, a sound deep and resonant like wood shifting under pressure. Then came the faint scrape, something moving behind the walls. They turned toward the sound, flashlights trembling in their hands. The noise grew louder, like fingernails dragging through the timber, slow and deliberate, circling the room. From beneath the floor came a soft thud, then another, rhythmic, steady, too steady to be the creak of settling wood. The air turned thick, the temperature dropping fast enough that their breath began to mist in front of them. The journal, still open on the floor, flipped to the very last blank page on its own, and a single drop of dark liquid seeped through from underneath, spreading slowly across the paper, forming the shape of a handprint that hadn't been there moments before. As the hikers stood frozen in the dim light of the cabin, the sound beneath the floorboards grew louder, shifting from dull thuds to something that almost resembled breathing. The boards seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, rising and falling slightly, as though something alive was pressing against them from below. Panic broke through the silence. One of the hikers backed toward the door, muttering that they needed to leave immediately, while another, drawn by some morbid fascination, knelt down and placed a hand on the wood. It was ice cold, yet it vibrated faintly, a subtle heartbeat pulsing through the grain. The moment he touched it, the humming that had haunted the cabin earlier began again, soft, almost tender at first, then swelling into a low, mournful cry that echoed through the walls. The air itself seemed to twist with the sound, bending the space around them. Then, without warning, the crying stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. For a moment, it felt as if time had frozen. That was when one of them realized someone was missing. The youngest of the group, the one who had first heard the crying under the floor, was gone. His flashlight lay near the doorway, its beam fixed on an open window where the fog rolled in thicker than ever before. They called his name, their voices cracking in the stillness, but no answer came. Only the faint creak of the floorboards and the rustle of trees outside responded. The air grew colder still, each breath turning into mist. Then came the sound, soft at first, almost like a lullaby, from deep within the woods. It was the same tune they had heard before, but this time it was accompanied by something else, something far more chilling, the cry of a newborn. The sound came closer, drifting through the fog, threading between the trees until it felt as though it were surrounding the cabin. One of the hikers stepped outside, calling for the missing boy, but the only answer was the faint wail of the infant echoing from somewhere unseen. The forest was alive with whispers again, countless voices murmuring in unison, all repeating the same name, the girl's name from the journal. The remaining hikers backed away, their flashlights trembling as shadows flickered across the trees. For a brief moment, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a woman in a torn white dress, her long hair matted, holding what looked like a small bundle against her chest. Her face was hidden, her posture eerily still. When the light fell on her, she slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were pale, hollow, and empty of life. And in that instant, the crying stopped. The woman turned toward them, her mouth opening as if to speak, but only the wind came out, a single whisper carried through the forest, soft as a prayer and final as death.